Hello. I want to tell you about React Hook that you probably don't know about, but there's a whole bunch of good use cases for it. And I'm not even sure if it's already in React itself, if it has landed or it's still experimented. But over the years of using React with hooks, I always was like very hopeful that it will finally land because sometimes it solves some problems that hooks themselves introduce, kind of. Yeah, instead of waiting for it, I just implemented it inside of UIX some time ago, and I just had a case for it today, and I thought it would be probably useful for whoever's using UIX to know a little bit more about this hook. So let's imagine a problem here. The problem is going to be imaginary, right? It's not like a real problem, and there is a different way to do it without even reaching to these hooks. But I just wanted to have a small example for you. Okay, so we have a mouse tracker, and it is disabled. You have to enable it by pressing the button, and once it is enabled, the component will render X and Y position of a mouse pointer. The trick is that the component is quite small, but we want to track mouse pointer position across entire web page, right? So we have to reach outside of the component. Let's take a look how we can do it. So first of all, we already have a local state that's being toggled when you press a button. It's not visualized yet, but it's already here. And second of all, since we want to reach outside of the component to the entire document, it means that we cannot just assign an onMouseMove to an element inside of the React component. We have to use document@event_listener API. So how we would do that, right? So we would do document@event_listener mouseMove, and then I would create a handler here that takes an event, reads X value of the screen, Y value of the screen, and then maybe we will have something like set coords X and Y, and this will be a local state that holds a tuple of X and Y values, right? And then we can add an event listener. Of course, you can do it in React, but you will bump into a whole bunch of problems. First of all, you cannot do it in a render function, like in the component itself, because every time the component will rerun, you will add a new listener, which means you will end up with a whole bunch of listeners, and you don't want that. So like the function, the render function here, the component function, is a pure function. It runs and returns something. And add an event listener is a side effect. So we have to move it into an effect, a useEffect hook. I want to pass the function, an array of dependencies, and now when the component renders, this hook will run only once because it just takes an empty vector of dependencies. But also we should not forget to remove the event listener when component goes away, because maybe in your app you are navigating away to a different route, rendering a different view, and you want to make sure that this event listener is never fired, right? So we have to return a function from useEffect and use remove event listener, and that probably should work, but we're getting a warning here, a compiler warning that useEffect is missing a dependency, and in this case the dependency is a handler function, right? So the problem we are hitting here is that in React, hooks that have dependencies supposed to list those dependencies inside of the vector here. And the reason for that is that you have this kind of pure world that renders, not even renders, it's just producing some UI structure that describes what you're going to see on the screen. And then we have side effects isolated inside of useEffect, for example. And if you are not listing a dependency here, basically a variable that's living outside of the effect scope, you're putting yourself at a risk of unsynchronizing your effects with data. So basically you can think of this dependency array as a way to subscribe your effectful operation to data. And whenever this data changes, the effect will rerun. And the return function is a cleanup function, because most of the times when you perform an effect, you'll probably or sometimes you'll probably want to clean up the effect, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So if we do it this way, it's going to be fine, and it compiles. And if we enable the tracker, wait, I'm not rendering the value, X and Y, let's see, it works fine. But there is a catch. So now, since the effect is subscribed to handler function, let's see what happens if we put print statement here. You can see in the console here that when I move the mouse, the print statement is executed on every mouse move, which means that this effect runs after every render, basically. And that happens because the handler function that's created here is created inline. So on every render, it's a different value. So this effect is going to rerun. So we can fix it by moving the handler inside of the effect. Handler, right, like this, right? And then we no longer need the effect here. Okay. And this works, but we still don't have, like, we're still not controlling the tracker with the button. So whenever I press, it doesn't have any effect, right? So what we want to do, we want to say when the tracker is enabled, then we want to update the coordinates, right? If I compile it, I'm going to have another warning, because now we're using enabled inside of the effect. And we have to subscribe to the enable var, right? And in this case, like if I go back and also put a print statement here again, in this case, we won't see the print statement to run on every mouse move, but only whenever I press the button. You can see when I'm moving, nothing is happening in the console, but when I press the button, we see the log statement. And that's fine. That's like not a big reason to add not a big deal to add and remove a listener once you press the button. That's like totally normal. But I just wanted to show you an example where we have some piece of data that the entire effect should be subscribed to, even though we don't really care, like this effect doesn't really care about being reactive to this, like to be not reactive, but like let's say subscribe to this data, right? Because this handler, it doesn't really care about whenever, like it shouldn't rerun, let's say this handler shouldn't rerun when enabled is true or false. The only condition why this handler runs is when we move the mouse. And this is kind of a problem because like we still have to subscribe the effect. This is the rule. So what we can do instead, we can use the effect event to pass the callback here, and then just use the handler inside of the effect. And if we compile the program, you will see that the compiler is not complaining. And the reason is that because useEffectEvent, so first of all, it doesn't. You can see that it doesn't take. It's not taking a vector of dependencies. So this hook was specifically created for cases where you have some sort of callback function that's using data outside of its scope. It's like referencing local variables or state, but the callback itself doesn't have to be reactive on that data. It doesn't have to rerun when the data changes, because it doesn't really care. It's not a condition for it to run when the data changes. The only condition for it when to run under is when the function itself is called, and this is done via mouse move. So, and it's not only about mouse move. It can be like a WebSocket handler. You might have some kind of additional data where you perform some checks, or maybe you are sending some data. Maybe it's analytics. So you could imagine that you can have like a send analytics function here, and maybe you want to run this function only once when user visits the, like when this component is mounted, because it's maybe the component of some particular route in your application, and you want to run this event just once to record in your analytics that user visited this route. So right, but let's say that your analytics event has to include some data, and maybe this data comes from properties. I don't know, like maybe there is something like user ID here, right? And you want to do this, but you cannot because you will have to subscribe to user ID. Like, and in this particular example, it's also fine and it makes sense because whenever user ID changes, it means that a different user is entering the app, is navigating, for example. But that's not going to happen because this is like a client-side browser, so you cannot have multiple users unless the user is re-logging in or something. But yeah, you might have some additional data, and you don't want this analytic event to be recorded when this data changes. Maybe that's like I don't know, a number of some things that user has when they arrive on this component or on this view, and you want to just record this event once instead of every time when this number of things change, right? So you can just move it inside of useEffectEvent and call it here, and you don't have to subscribe. All right. So yeah, I don't think there is a lot of use cases for useEffectEvent, but sometimes you might be wondering, like, how do I get rid of dependencies, because like I don't want something to rerun, or I need to cache something and I don't really care about reactivity of my hooks based on data. I just want to cache some callbacks and that's it. So this is where you have to use useEffectEvent.